Welcome back to Core Anesthesia. Whether you are a student prepping for tests and boards or a CRNA here to earn CEUs, we are glad you've joined us. For more about us, make sure to check us out on Instagram at Core Anesthesia and online at coreanesthesia.com.
Welcome back to Core Anesthesia. I'm Cole here with Tanner, and today we want to do a discussion from our 2022 Student Anesthesia Conference in July. We're so excited to announce that several of the speakers gave us their permission to go ahead and post their recorded session so that those that were unable to attend would be able to benefit from the knowledge and wisdom that they had to pass on. We know it was beneficial to a lot of the people that were able to listen to it live, and we hope it'll be beneficial to you today. The second session is going to be all about how to find your first job. Hopefully this is something you're looking at doing prior to graduation, especially in our area. From what I've looked at and from most of the country, this is a very good time to be graduating. There are so many different jobs out there that you can hire on with. Again, we just mentioned Bag Mask prior to this as a sponsor from our previous session. They're a great resource to go look at. But there's so many different avenues. And so I'm really excited that Dr. Rodriguez has joined us to discuss how do you find your first job? What are the things that you should be looking for? But again, I want to talk about our sponsor for this session. This session is made possible by our conference sponsor, Locums at Heart. Locums at Heart is an anesthesia staffing company whose focus is connecting high-quality anesthesia providers with industry-leading facilities. Locums at Heart is very proud to be a sponsor of this conference, and they wish you guys all the best as you're finishing your schooling. And they hope that you look at them if you're looking for a job placement from a locum standpoint. So now I want to introduce our speaker. Like I said, Dr. Joseph Rodriguez. He is the co-founder and managing partner at Arizona Anesthesia Solutions, a multi-state group of over 100 CRNAs and MDs based out of Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Rodriguez is the former president of the Arizona Association of Nurse Anesthesiology and currently on the board of directors for the American Association of Nurse Anesthesiology. Dr. Rodriguez has led policy reform at the state and federal level, led significant reform within the association itself, and he currently lectures at National University. He's written for the Washington Times, Anesthesiology News, the Arizona Capital Times, and Outpatient Surgery. He speaks nationally on business and leadership, and we are so excited to have him here today. So I want everybody to give a warm welcome to Dr. Joe Rodriguez as we welcome him to the stage.
Thanks, Cole and Tanner, so much for inviting me out. I'm going to get right into it. So you've probably already heard this advice. Go get a job at a big hospital with lots of support, all right? Because in your first few years, you really don't know anything. And I knew someone who took that advice, and we're going to call him Vince for the sake of this story. And Vince got a job at a big hospital in an anesthesia care team practice, and he was doing all these big fancy cases, and he came to our community hospital in Phoenix, Arizona. And I saw Vince in the hallway, and he said, hey, I'm going back with my case. Who's coming with me? And I said, well, in this practice, there's physicians and CRNAs. We work as a collaborative team, but the expectation is you go back and do your case. So what do you need? And he said, well, I need someone in there with me. And I said, why? And he said, well, I just need someone to start the case. And I said, is the patient particularly sick, or do you expect a difficult airway or anything? He said, no, I just need someone. And I knew in that moment that Vince was not going to last for very long. And Vince lasted about a week, and he decided that even though he took that advice, that same advice that you're getting now, most likely, that was bad advice, because Vince ultimately wasn't able to do relatively basic skills in anesthesia. That's the story. Here's the point. Finding a good job right now, as Cole alluded to, is really easy, right? When you look at objective measures of what a good job is generally, it's super easy to find that job. Finding the right job, something that positions you for long-term success, for long-term satisfaction for your life, that part is really, really difficult. We're going to get into that. So these slides will be available, I'm sure. I've been in this business a little while. You can read about my bio. I'm always mildly uncomfortable talking about myself. I'm also going to try to keep us relatively on time. But for the sake of this conversation, I want to back up a little bit. So I want to go back to the very, very far time to 2012, when I was in your position, when I was the one who was freaking out about studying boards. And I was the one who the computer turned off at 75 questions as well. And I moved out to Arizona. And one of the first things I did was I got involved in my professional association. Somebody gave me a call and they said, hey, we'd really like you to come to this meeting. And I said, I'm really busy right now. I'm moving. I haven't even taken my boards yet. And his name was Jose. And he said, look, the association needs you more than you need it. And it was a call to service. And I thought that was really compelling. So I went. And I went to this meeting and we're sitting in a boardroom just like this. And there's all these CRNAs who really want to improve the state of Arizona. And we're going to talk about how that changed over time and how that impacts your jobs. And I look across the room and I get voluntold to do something. And which means I was, told I could volunteer, but I was told to do it. And I was perfectly fine with that. And I look across the room and they said, you're going to work with this guy named Ali Bagai. And I was like, great. He seems like a nice guy. And then right next to me, we began to have a little bit of a debate about an issue. There's this other gentleman. His name is Randy Quinn. And Randy made a point and I made a counterpoint. And the details are irrelevant, but I said something to the effect of, the problem with your idea is it's not very sexy. Not very appealing. And Randy he was sitting right to my left, and he turned back and he looked at me and he gave me the dirtiest look I can ever remember. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I just got here and I'm already making people really upset. Turns out Randy was actually on the board of nursing in the state of Arizona. And in that moment, I realized something, that if you're going to find the best potential opportunities, they don't come typically, almost never, through clicking on an ad on Facebook. They don't come typically through talking to a recruiter that you've never met. They typically come, the very best positions for you come through being engaged in service to others. And here's why. It's a little paradoxical. When people see you serving your community, serving others, they realize that you are not a selfish person. They realize that you are someone who's willing to put the group ahead of their own needs. And then they are more willing to share with you or create with you the best possible opportunities for your career so you can have a great life. Remember, anesthesia is a people business, okay? That is one of the number one things you can take away from probably this conference, but especially this presentation. Anesthesia is a people business. It is about who you work with. That is what's going to create value in your life. The best jobs are never advertised. And as you can guess, the two people in that picture where we're both being silly and being professional, those are the two people I met in that conference room on that day at the very beginning of my professional career. We did things together that were not necessarily about work or making money. It was about making the community better. And through that, we established trust and credibility. And that's how we were able to build an organization that has the level of credibility it does in the state of Arizona at the least. So what makes a good job? All right. Many of you are going to hear what I like to call $1 answers to $1 million questions. This is the type of thing you hear in the elevator. It's the type of thing you might discuss at the end of a lecture, and it might sound good. Get a job at a hospital with lots of support. Get something that works for you. Find a position that feels right. Right? These are all the commonalities, the truisms, the aphorisms, the colloquialisms that people use when giving you advice. One of the main takeaways from this presentation is that is generally bad advice. And it's probably, everyone says it because it's only true. It is true, but only to a degree, right? So good positions give you what you want in the future and support your growth today, right? There's a picture of a scale behind these words because all of these things have to be measured on a scale. All of them are important to a degree. What's important for you to find the right position, the best position, is for you to measure these out with your own subjective value and then to make a decision in the most informed way possible. Look, I could have sent you a slide. I could have sent Tanner and Cole a slide that says, look, here are the various dimensions, and everyone should just rate a score, and that's how you pick the best position. And that would probably get you a decent answer. But it's really only through getting insight and what we like to call average aggregated decision making, which is learning from others. It's a fancy way to say learning from others, that you can get the best possible decision for yourself and for your career. So let's break this down a little bit. When you first get out of your program, there's a reason clinical services autonomy is bolded there or increased in size. When you first get out of your program, you are relatively green. There is still a tremendous amount of clinical information, clinical skills that you need to polish before you are a experienced professional. Often it's said that, your first 3 years are like the last 3 years of your training. And I can testify that that is true. Okay, so obviously it goes without saying that the broadest clinical experience that you can get, whether it's OB or trauma or even doing nuanced things like dental anesthesiology, the broadest experience you can get in those first 3 years with a reasonable amount of support, that's going to be the best clinical job that you can get. And that's always true, right? The devil's in the details of how that really happens. And let's go back to our example of Vince, and that's not his real name. Vince went to a level 1 prestigious university hospital where he was doing cases that only existed in the 1 or 2% of the world. They were highly advanced cases. That did not give him the autonomy, the diversification, the confidence to do what's in the mean of the curve, to do a lap chole with relative little assistance, to do a shoulder arthroscopy without major assistance, to do the relatively basic skills that go along with that case, such as a peripheral nerve block. That is the challenge that Vince had, and that's why he couldn't go into many other places, why he struggled. And that's a stressful thing that Vince went through. Now, a lot of people come to me, and just for a little bit of background, our company, because we have CRNAs and MDs, we kind of obsess over clinical autonomy. And we've been able to convert a lot of very restrictive models to very autonomous models, including CRNA only, in fact, predominantly CRNA only models throughout the state, which has been great. It's been great. With that being said, a lot of folks come to me and say, look, I've been in XYZ ACT practice. I'm only in my program. I've only been at a university setting. For me, it was Thomas Jefferson University, pretty restrictive setting. Certainly CRNAs were there to support. My perception was that we were there to support the MD residency. We weren't necessarily there to become accomplished professionals on our own. And we certainly weren't there to, accomplish the needs of the community, because the needs are overwhelming right now. So I'm just keeping my eye, making sure Connor and Tanner and Cole are not texting me and making sure my connection isn't working. So clinical service autonomy, a lot of people come to me and say, hey, how do I make this transition, right? And there's two answers here. The first is the easy answer, right? If you're in a really restrictive setting, you want to find a less restrictive setting. But what is the key fundamental ingredient that you need if you're making that transition? Or if you're coming out of your program and you're heading into a more autonomous position? People say, what is the most important thing to have? And look, clinical experience matters, but that's always variable, right? Determination matters, and all these kind of soft things matter. But the number one ingredient is this: it's how you think. It is critical thinking ability. Because in our job, right, 90% of the time, most people think what we do is boring. 90% of the time, people are thinking that I'm going to be really honest with you here. A lot of people think we're a bunch of overpaid nurses, that we're paid far too much, right? And that has to do with public perception, has to do with the traditional position of nursing, right? And there's not a whole lot we can do to fix that quickly. That's a very slow fix over the time. But the bottom line is, a lot of people look at us and think we make a lot of money for being able to be in relatively stable cases 90% of the time. And when they make that conclusion, they're not thinking about the 10% of the time, right? When absolutely no one wants our job. I'll give you a perfect example. From 2016 to really the beginning of this year, I was the anesthesia director at a surgery center. I actually served as medical director as well, participated on the board, and it was a really great experience. In 5 years of practice, we had some incidents at that surgery center where we had to transfer patients out. We had patients wake up with chest pain. We had somebody go into rhabdomyolysis. But the most scary moment, the moment that 10% of the time really was true for me, was at the end of a very routine case. It's always how it is. And we were closing up a hernia, and I extubated the patient deep, just like I've done for a decade. Everything was going swimmingly, and the patient began to have a bronchospasm. And clinically, this looked like a bronchospasm. It looked like a laryngospasm. All I knew was that my tidal volumes were decreasing rapidly. Over about 60 seconds, they went from about 600 to about 100 or 50. The patient wasn't the most healthy, certainly fine for a surgery center, but did not have a lot of leeway in his oxygen saturation. So his oxygen saturation began to go down, so very quickly moved through the difficult airway algorithm. I'm putting my hand on, I'm trying to bag, and look, I do not have small hands. Okay, I can ventilate the vast majority of the human population. Did everything, put the oral airways in. All of a sudden, we're calling for help. I tried to re-intubate him, couldn't. I had just reversed him, so I was not too keen on re-paralyzing him. Not getting too deep into pharmacology for this lecture, but needless to say, it was becoming very critical very quickly. And I looked at my friend, he's a surgeon, and I said, Eric, you better get the knife, man. Like, I don't know how this is going to go. You need to be ready. And by that, I mean an emergency surgical airway, for those who are learning. That was a critical moment. Right? And eventually we ended up reparalyzing. Some other CRNAs were in the building, which was super helpful. And we ended up getting him back breathing without having to reintubate him, without having to use a surgical airway. But we were there. We were ready to prep the neck. And in that moment, everybody in that room knew exactly the kind of risk and liability that you were going to take on in every single case. Congratulations. Welcome to the career, right? Now, thankfully, that risk is fairly minimal on every single case, but it exists. And that's why 10% of the time, no one ever wants your job. And this next statement is really important. Your real value is not managing 90% of what you do, right? Your real value comes in managing that 10%, making sure those 10% of emergencies either never happen, and when they do happen, they're managed absolutely correctly. This is the type of thinking that you get when you're in a job that promotes your clinical autonomy, your professional development. If you're in a position which restricts your thinking, which treats you like a second-class citizen, which doesn't let you have these types of conversations, doesn't get you involved into the decision-making, that is deeply problematic for your long-term career health. It is deeply problematic for a long and diversified career. And eventually, you're going to run into a position where either you can't take the position or you just don't know what to do. And there's potential harm there. Okay. So good jobs position you to do what you want to do in the future and support your growth. We talked about the clinical services autonomy. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, I've been able to work with really, really great people. That does involve hiring and recruiting quite a bit. And I like to, as Tanner will tell you, I like to personally interview virtually everyone who comes through our company, who eventually becomes a member of our company. We split that up by region to some degree, but I really enjoy that personal touch. And what I've noticed over time from the individuals who I have hired, who have been brought into our company, is that over time, they need a place to grow. The other thing I've noticed is that people will go to other companies on a fairly consistent basis in the Phoenix market, especially, and they will go to these companies and they'll get the clinical services management. They'll learn how to think. They'll develop all the skills. But when they look to say, hey, how can I contribute further? What is the pathway? Is there anything established? Is there anything formalized where I can continue to grow in my career here? The answer is usually no, and it's kind of a shrug, and most clinical organizations don't have these pathways very well developed, because eventually around year 2 or 3, what I have noticed is that CRNAs get a little bored, in the sense of they've now taken on the challenge of clinical practice. And around year 3, the end of year 3, in my experience, they realize, you know what, I've got this down. I'm pretty decent at it. And if that happens, it doesn't happen for everyone, but if that does happen, all these other things you see on the slide, entrepreneurship, practice leadership, whether it's managing the schedule or starting your own, right? Institutional leadership, getting involved in the quality measures of the hospital, getting involved in perioperative services, advanced clinical practice. You've done what you've done, right? And now you want to do something at a subspecialty level, right? And then people's lives change as well. You have kids, you don't have kids, you want to travel more, you want to, optimize your anesthesia life so you can run a side gig, right? You want to maximize your financial position. You want to get rid of all your, that's what I did. You want to get rid of all your student debt as soon as humanly possible to give you the most choices later on in life. These are the types of positions, if your organization, if your job can help you do these things, right? That is going to be the highest value position you can possibly find. And it's not about the money, right? Making money in this market is super easy. It is super easy. It's about how do you do it? Where do you do it? And who do you do it with? That's the point. So finding a great job is easy. Finding the right job is hard. Okay. Now, when I was coming out back in 2012, we had a saying: money, autonomy, and location. Pick 2. That was, we did not have Tanners and Coles in my world. We were still on forums. Facebook barely existed. So that was the great advice that I got. So I went to the town you actually see, which is Northwest Phoenix. And there was a group called, I probably shouldn't mention the name. Anyway, so a group in Northwest Phoenix, and they at least provided the autonomy. Compensation was significantly lower by 20, 30, 40% for new graduates coming out of their program. And I did that for a little while, and it was really good. I learned a tremendous amount. I worked so much. I actually worked 60 hours a week, every week for 50 weeks. That was my first year because I had a habit of not saying no to people. And I really wanted to succeed. I wanted to do as much as I possibly could, get my hands on as many central lines, get my hands on as many peripheral nerve blocks and all the super sick patients. And it had the autonomy I was looking for. I ran my own room every day, but it also had the support in the background, which is really important when you're coming out of your program, especially with the level of acuity that we were dealing with. So just like I described earlier, I did that for about 2 years. And I said, okay, I think, I'm decent at this. I'm not making major mistakes. And if I'm close to making them, usually I catch myself before I do them. So at one point, we were sitting in the lounge, my boss and I said, I love being here, and I love the people here, but there's some things that are really a struggle. The schedule is horrible. I never, ever know when I'm going to leave at night. My wife is not going to tolerate this much longer. I'd really like to get involved here in leadership in some way. I can write policies. I can do the schedule. Summarizing a lot of different conversations, I was essentially told if I wanted to get involved in that level of things, then I should have been an MD. And then he turned around from the lounge. He got up and he walked out. And that was that. So here's the point. I got what I needed in the short term from that position. It was the right position at the time. But they lost a member because at that moment, I made the decision. I said, we can do this better. We can serve people better. We can serve facilities better than what's going on here. Even though there were some elements, there were some fundamentals that were really good, especially the autonomy and the clinical practice, the interprofessional practice. But what's really interesting is they not only lost a member, they actually created a competitor, because our organization currently competes with that group. And they did it because they were not fostering growth, right? All I needed at that point, at that 2-year mark, was an opportunity. I didn't need, to be an equal partner in an organization that was years and years old. I didn't need to be able to buy in or anything, kind of outrageous like that. I just needed to be part of something. And they weren't offering that. And then we decided, like I showed in the earlier slides, we decided to go out and create something of our own, right? And that's the risk that people don't see, right? It's the things you cannot anticipate, which usually come back around to bite you when you're not following sound principles, when you're not living by your values, right? That's the point. Remember, finding a good job is easy. Finding the right job is hard. So, why do you have this opportunity? What does this have to do with picking the right job now, picking the right job in the future? Now, if anyone, I would presume we have some Canadians on the line. We've got close to 1,000 attendees. If anyone recognizes the city to the left, it's Toronto. Great city. Go Blue Jays, right? Europe is on the map there, and you can see the picture of the land down under, the flag from the land down under Australia. What do all these countries have in common, right? They're all westernized countries, just like ours. They all have very similar economies. Certainly, there's a lot of trouble in the world geopolitically today, but we still have a great deal of similarities with these nations. What do they also have in common about CRNAs? We don't exist. We don't exist in these countries. Now, we may exist in some sort of shadow, right? France is probably the closest thing. But they have nowhere near the level of autonomy, nowhere near the level of responsibility, the compensation potential, nowhere near the market saturation, right? CRNAs are nearly ubiquitous. And we are on track, not to get too far off today's lecture, we are on track to be, we are arguably already the predominant anesthesia provider in this nation, right? The world's biggest economy. That did not happen by accident, right? When you look at our country and you look at our professional association, that is why you're in this conference. Look, I actually really like this topic, and I could spend probably 2 or 3 hours just diving into the socioeconomic factors of how you are sitting in the chair that you're sitting in right now. All of the different decision points, all the different gating points where if someone had made a left instead of a right, if a judge had made one decision instead of another, you wouldn't be here today. It's a fascinating story, but it's not for today. The bottom line is this. Without our professional association, still active today, you would not be sitting where you are, okay? And without active professional associations now and leaders now, some of whom I assume are listening to this call, you won't have the right job in the future, right? Because the best job, the right job, is where you're making your full contribution, where you get that full sense of satisfaction, not just for yourself, but for your community as well. That doesn't happen without active leadership. Let me demonstrate it to you, okay? Let me connect this dot between regulatory reform and advocacy, right? These terms that you may or may not be very familiar with, and how it impacts your real life. Now, there's 2 pictures on the slide here currently. One is Arches National Park, and one is a place I was at just last year for my 38th birthday, which is the Grand Canyon, right? Now, one is in Utah, one is in Arizona. Now, if you circle back to 2012, there was a tremendous amount of commonalities between these 2 states. Very few opportunities for CRNAs, okay? Cartel-like blockade on positions, very active, highly intelligent, very successful MD organizations that were and or are determined to minimize CRNA influence, okay? And the opportunities that existed for CRNAs were less than ideal. And I'm putting that in a professional slide, but to say that's an understatement, to be clear, okay? There are positions for CRNAs where you were essentially a scribe, right? You're taking on all this risk, this liability, this financial debt, right, to get a professional services skill. You're entering the professional services economy. The positions here, ICU nurses had more autonomy than CRNAs in these positions, and it was very similar in these 2 states, okay? 10 years later, one is an AA state now, the first state in many, many years to sign off on AA legislation, in a state with already very few CRNA positions. I don't know if it will be a CRNA state in the future, right, just because of the political dynamic there. The other is a national leader in autonomous practice. CRNA practice has exploded across the state of Arizona, right? Why the difference? The difference was because of 2 main things. The first is In Arizona, 10 years ago, we had that meeting in 2012. I told you about the meeting with Allie and Randy. I didn't tell you about the result, but at that meeting, a number of dedicated individuals, a small group of dedicated individuals said, we are going to make Arizona a great place to practice. We live here, we're dedicated, we're going to make it happen. And so we changed the regulatory environment, which legalizes, which regulates, which guides our practice. That was part one. The next thing we did, and this is absolutely key, and what most people forget, is you can change the law, but if you don't develop the practice leadership, if you don't go put it into practice, it doesn't matter. Okay? We changed the laws, and then we went out, and by we, I mean the entire community. We went out and developed practice wins as well. That is what created a massive divergence. So now you have, fast forward to today, Utah is still, unfortunately, and look, I have friends who practice there. There are rare positions that come up there. They are paid below the market because CRNAs who are there have a personal connection, which means they are willing to work then less than what is considered market value. And now that AAs have been passed there, it's a reasonable consideration that the future does not really involve CRNAs there, especially because of long-term professional influence. Again, another topic which is beyond the scope of this lecture. But over time, as things become enculturated in that community, it's going to be much, much harder to develop opportunities. Not impossible, but harder. Okay? Now, the facts differ wherever you are. The facts are going to differ, right? But the principles here do not change. When you have leadership, right, and you have leadership in the professional world, which is really two things when it comes to CRNA practice or even healthcare practice, which is you change the regulations, you have a favorable regulatory environment, and then you, whatever that environment is, you make it as good as you can, and then you go out and make those practice opportunities happen, right? Here's the point. Your opportunities don't just happen, right? This didn't happen by mistake. You're able to take on this risk to reap the benefit because other people for the past 100 years or so have been taking on risks so you can reap those benefits. They have been investing back into the community, into the professional community, often at great personal cost. Many stories to share there. So when you're a member of this community, right, it is essential for you to know that it is not just your patients you are looking after. It is also your profession because of the nature of the competitive environment we live in. And this is an unfortunate reality. I wish it weren't this way, but as it turns out, humanity is humanity. So it is what it is. So it's better to just be aware and to adjust. Your obligation, again, is not just to protect your patients. It's also to protect your profession, right? Another way to think about this is a train. I like this allegory, this metaphor. Sometimes it's very easy to ride the train, and that's what you're doing, right? But once you're comfortable on the train, it's also your responsibility to make sure the train actually has a track to run on, right? And that involves some very professional, basic responsibilities. Being an ANA member, being a member of your professional association, making some sort of contribution, whether it's time, volunteering, or financial, right? I've been giving $25 a month to above and beyond my membership for forever, right? I've been doing it forever, and many, many people do in the state of Arizona. We have a great community here. And being engaged in your professional community, these are the things, I'm telling you with 100% certainty, these are the things that are going to help you find the absolute best position for you. Because people are going to realize that you're about more than just yourself, right? Finding a good job is easy. Finding the right job is hard. All right, we need to talk about curves now, okay? Bonus points to anyone who recognized the Antelope Canyon there, all right? Now, everyone knows this curve. It's normal distribution, a bell curve, a Gaussian curve, to use the more academic term. Now, among nurses, look, you guys are already at the top 20%. Among those who are in their program, you're probably, okay, so reevaluate and restart the curve, right? Among all nurses, you're already at the top performance because you're in this program, right? So among all those top performers, you are probably, again, in the top 20% of that 20% because you're here, because you're interested in learning, because you're doing something that the other 80% are not, right? My job today, my intent today is to keep pushing you towards that top end of the curve, okay? And why do I have a vested interest in doing that? Because the stronger our community is, the stronger our profession is, the stronger we all are. And as someone who has been involved in the national level, it is very easy for me to see, and part of my job here is to make it easy for you to see that all of these things are connected. What happens in Alaska and Florida, New York and California, our world is increasingly becoming smaller. All the communication is going faster and faster. And the truth is, look, at a practical level, if I can hire more CRNAs that are more comfortable with the type of practice that we continue to move towards, that is really in demand in the community, that makes us a better organization. That makes us a better profession. Now, look, most business people are really focused on the bottom line. And I have a whole working theory about that, about Milton Friedman versus more current corporate social responsibility theories. Again, a subject for another lecture. But most business people are only interested in what generates the dollars today, right? What generates more revenue, more profit, et cetera, et cetera. But as a business person who's interested in obviously our business, but also the community at large, I'm interested in what makes all of us get towards that top performing edge, because ultimately that's what generates value in our communities, right? That's what makes us a stronger country. That's what makes us more competitive at a global level. And let's go back a little bit. We are only an American phenomenon. So at a very, very broad level, I have a vested interest in making sure that I can do everything I can to make sure you are doing well, make sure our country is doing well. I want to show you one more curve though, okay? So you're the top 20% of the top 20% of nursing, right? And now you need to think about things in terms of the Pareto distribution, okay? So there's this idea, and when I showed you a slide earlier with a field, that was intentional. There's an Italian economist named Vincent Pareto, okay? And he derived that 80% of results, sometimes 90, depending on the quote, comes from 10% of people, right? So not only do we want you, and I think Tanner and Cole would probably agree with this, want you to be at the top of that curve, right? We also want this Pareto law to become true as well. We want people who are the influential few. That is what generates the most value, not just for them, but for their community as well. You're probably picking up on a theme here, right? Anyone can shell out $1 answers when it comes to where to have the best job. I could have sent over a very simple scale. We could have filled it out on SurveyMonkey, and this presentation would have been over in 2 minutes. Okay. But the goal today is to push you towards the far end of the curve, to push you and make you the best person you can possibly be, to make sure you get as much out of your career as possible, because you are taking on risk, right? You cannot discharge educational debt in bankruptcy. Right now, the upside is when you look at the overall finances and economics of this career decision, congratulations, you made one of the best choices in the American economy, right? But our goal is to make sure you get as much out of your career as possible. Remember, finding a good job is easy. Finding the right job is hard. Okay. A couple final thoughts here. You're in your learning mode. You're in your program. So I'm going to get a little academic just for a moment. You have a moral and ethical obligation to do your best, right? When you do your best, you can have absolutely no regrets, right? And your best changes for everyone, right? If you're sick, it's not as good, right? If you're going through a divorce, or your mother's dying, or any one of those things, your best changes, but you have an obligation to do your very best, right? For yourself and your family and your community. Let's think about Vince for a moment, that CRNA, a reference at the very beginning of the presentation. Think about his situation, right? He thought he was coming into a place where he could do the most advanced stuff, and he came in with a very high degree of confidence. And very quickly, he realized that he was struggling with doing fairly basic things because he took some of that advice, and he took that early advice of, well, just get a big job in a big hospital and everything will be okay. Right? That was poor advice. But I want you guys to ask a question. Do you think, did Vince have people around him encouraging him to be his best? Okay, the answer is probably not. Right? I think Vince was a really smart guy, very capable. There's nothing magic about what we were doing, right? But I don't think, looking back, Vince had people who were looking out for his interests. And that I find to be very disappointing, right? I don't think that we had people around Vince who were making decisions with values that were aligned with his well-being. So when we're around people who deliberately hold us back, right, or do not encourage us to grow, that is when we make the wrong choices. That is when we have the wrong values guiding us. That's not really the only wrong decision you can make in terms of what type of job to get, okay? Those decisions are the ones that cost us more than we ever realize, because we never fully realize how much we've lost, right? And that's why it's so important. That's why all of my lectures really focus on fundamentals, right? Find the right group of people, right? The people who are going to encourage you to be your best. That is how you're going to cycle through all the details, right, of what you really want out of a job, whether it's compensation or lifestyle or scheduling, or whether it's W-2 or 1099. All of those things are very, very easy. Like, they're super easy. Like, you could cycle through the decision-making process in about 45 seconds, right? All these other things, they're much more challenging because they take time to think through. They take time to associate yourself with the right type of people and to prioritize things in your life. And that's what's most important, I think, when you're trying to find the right job for you and your family. So again, finding a good job is easy. Finding the right job or jobs is hard. I'm going to end on this very practical note. Sometimes we can't find the very best position that we want because, look, I grew up outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My family's all still there. And had I stayed there, finding the best job for me personally would have been very difficult. So at a practical level, what I often suggest to people is, look, find more than one job. Get a job where you get 3 12s and, you have lots of time off to pick up at other places, because increasingly in every market throughout the country right now, we're seeing better and higher quality jobs for CRNAs popping up, right? And that's because entrepreneurs are often creating them, or facilities are demanding them. So now it's even easier, if you can't find the best job as your primary gig, so to speak, is to pick up something on the side and then, do that other position for a few years and then switch over to full-time doing what you like. So with that, I'm going to stop right there. And I think it's 8:50. So I am going to stop sharing and see if hopefully there's lots of interesting comments and questions.
Thank you for listening to this pre-recorded session from our 2022 student conference. For more about our speakers, please read their bio in the show notes, and we'll see you on the next episode.